to the investigation that there were no signs of an assault inside Nancy's house. The house was mostly clean, and the way it was described to me is that some rooms were actually immaculate.
Nobody calls a homicide detective to a house where nothing happened. That is the fact this entire true crime case rests on. That is the thread that once you pull it, unravels every official statement, every press conference, every carefully worded public update that has come out of Pima County, Arizona since the night Nancy Guthrie disappeared. And before this documentary is over, that single fact is going to reframe everything you think you know about what happened inside that house. But let's start somewhere else. Let's start with the word that a source close to this investigation used to describe the interior of Nancy Guthrie's home after she vanished. Not chaotic, not disturbed, not the kind of scene you picture when a woman goes missing in the dead of night in the middle of an American city. This source, speaking to journalist Brian Anton on March 31st, used one specific word to describe certain rooms inside that house. And that word was immaculate, clean, untouched, undisturbed.
To the investigation that there were no signs of an assault inside Nancy's house. The house was mostly clean, and the way it was described to me is that some rooms were actually immaculate.
Now here's where this true crime case splits wide open. Because on that same night, in that same house, in front of the same door that led into those immaculate rooms, law enforcement found blood. Nancy Guthrie's blood. Confirmed by DNA testing conducted by the Pima County Sheriff's Department, right there at the front threshold of her home in Tucson, Arizona. And according to journalist Ashley Banfield's reporting, the pattern of that blood extended outward over the threshold and out the front door. Her blood, moving away from the house. While the rooms behind that door looked like nobody had touched them. Most people heard those two details and kept scrolling. Clean rooms, blood at the door. They registered it as alarming and moved on. But retired FBI agent Jennifer Coffindaffer did not keep scrolling, because Jennifer Coffindaffer knows something that most people consuming the headlines around this case do not. She knows what it means when a sheriff's department assigns a homicide detective to a missing persons case on day 1, not day 3, not after a body is recovered, not after forensic results come back from a lab. Day 1, before anyone publicly used the word homicide, before that word appeared in a single mainstream headline. The Pima County Sheriff's Department made a command-level operational decision in the opening hours of this investigation that communicated clearly to every experienced investigator watching exactly what they believed had happened to Nancy Guthrie. And that decision does not square with a house full of immaculate rooms. Those two things cannot both be true without a third thing explaining them. And that third thing has not been made public. Not in any press conference, not in any official statement, not anywhere in the weeks of public-facing coverage this case has generated. That gap, the space between what a source close to the investigation is describing and what law enforcement's own operational decisions are silently communicating, is exactly where the truth of this case is hiding. Nancy Guthrie is the mother of Savannah Guthrie, one of the most recognized news anchors in the United States. Her disappearance from her home broke across every major network within hours, and from the very beginning, something about the official response felt like it was running ahead of the evidence, like the people in charge already knew something the rest of the country was still catching up to. This documentary is about that something. Before we go any further, we need to establish the ground we are standing on, because in true crime documentary work, the difference between analysis and speculation is sourcing. And this documentary is going to be precise about that distinction every single time. Here's what Pima County Sheriff's Department has officially confirmed. Nancy Guthrie's blood was found at the front entrance of her home. DNA testing was conducted. The results came back. The blood at that front entrance belonged to Nancy Guthrie. That is the bedrock. That is the confirmed foundation that every other piece of this case gets built on top of. Beyond what PCSD has officially confirmed, journalist Ashley Banfield described the specific pattern of that blood in greater detail, attributing her information to a single source.
They are identical. They are droplets that are undisturbed. They are just quite literally a trail of blood droplets that goes from the front hall over the threshold of the front door.
According to that reporting, the blood presented as droplets. And those droplets did not pool in one location. They did not suggest a static event. They continued over the threshold and out the front door, moving, extending, traveling from the interior of the home toward the outside world. That description is sourced and attributed, and it has not been independently confirmed in any official public statement. We are reporting it, we are attributing it, and we are flagging it accordingly, because that is how a responsible true crime storytelling operates. Now let's talk about what blood at a threshold actually means forensically, because the location of this evidence is not incidental. It may be the single most significant piece of physical evidence the public currently knows about. Thresholds are transition spaces, forensically precise ones. A threshold is the physical boundary between inside and outside, between a controlled private space and the uncontrolled world beyond it. And when investigators find blood at a threshold, the first question they are trained to ask is not how much blood. It is which direction was this person moving. Direction tells a story that volume cannot. A blood trail left by someone who is upright and walking, even walking while injured, looks fundamentally different from a trail left by someone who is being carried or dragged. The spacing between droplets reflects the pace of movement. The shape of individual drops reflects the orientations of the bodies producing them. A horizontal body drips differently than a vertical one. A person being pulled across a surface leaves a smear pattern. A person moving under their own power leaves discrete, sequential, readable droplets. These are not subtle differences. To a trained forensic eye, they are significant and often determinative. Ashley Bamfield's reporting describes droplets continuing over the threshold and out the front door. That description, if accurate, is consistent with a person who is upright and mobile when they cross that threshold, not dragged, not carried horizontally, moving on their feet, bleeding while in motion through a defined space and out of it. Now layer that against what Brian Anton's source reported. Certain rooms inside that home were immaculate. No signs of assault and no disturbance. The interior did not tell the story of a crime that spread throughout the house. The blood was concentrated in that one single, precise location, the front door. And in true crime, when a crime is that contained, when the physical evidence points to a single defined point of exit, rather than a chaotic scene spread across multiple rooms and spaces, experienced investigators do not read that as disorganization. They read it as the opposite. They read it as control, as planning, as someone who knew exactly where this was going to happen and made sure it happened nowhere else. If Nancy Guthrie was upright and mobile when she crossed that threshold, if the blood pattern reflects a person moving under at least some degree of their own power, then she was not incapacitated somewhere deep inside the house before she reached the door. She walked. She moved. She crossed that threshold as a person who, at least in that moment, was physically capable of locomotion, which means she went to that door. And the moment you accept that possibility, the entire shape of this case changes. Because now you are not asking how did someone get into that house and overpower her. Now you're asking something far more unsettling. You are asking what brought Nancy Guthrie to her own front door in the middle of the night, and what was compelling enough, real enough, credible enough to get her moving through her home and opening that entrance in the dark. In true crime investigation, that question almost always leads down one of two paths. And those two paths have a name: trust or coercion. Coercion is the version most people imagine first. Someone creates a condition outside that door that forces compliance. A threat. A voice presenting a scenario that makes opening the door feel like the only option. Coercion managed from outside the threshold would not necessarily require a physical confrontation inside the home. A person can walk to their own front door, under their own power, without a single piece of furniture being displaced, if what is compelling them to walk is fear rather than physical force. That explanation fits a clean interior. It fits a person moving upright through a threshold. It fits a blood trail describing motion rather than dragging. But here's where the second path becomes harder to dismiss. What if Nancy Guthrie opened that door, not because she was afraid of what was on the other side, but because she recognized it? What if she moved toward that entrance willingly, not under threat, not under coercion, but because the person or the situation waiting for her was something she had reason to believe was safe? A familiar voice, a known face, a knock that carried a context she had no reason to question. A clean interior does not rule out coercion, but it lends weight to trust. Because if someone was forcing this situation from inside the home, if there was a confrontation in any room before Nancy ever reached that door, the interior would likely reflect it, and a source close to the investigation is telling us it did not. Which means either the coercion began and ended at the door itself, never penetrating the interior, or Nancy Guthrie was not being coerced when she walked toward it. And if she was not being coerced, if she was moving toward that threshold because something on the other side gave her a reason to, then whoever was waiting for her at that front entrance had something most strangers do not have: credibility, a relationship, access to her world in a way that a random, opportunistic actor simply does not possess. In true crime, that is called insider knowledge, and it narrows the field significantly. It eliminates the random. It points investigators away from strangers and towards someone with a connection, someone who knew Nancy Guthrie's home, her habits, her schedule, and her sense of safety well enough to use all of that against her at the exact moment she was most vulnerable. Let's go back to that word, because it has not received nearly enough serious examination in the public conversation around this case. Immaculate, not clean, not undisturbed, not showing no signs of a struggle. Immaculate. That specific word in that specific context is doing something a more neutral descriptor would not do. It is making a point. And in the context of an active investigation into a missing woman, in the context of a case where law enforcement deployed a homicide detective on day one, it is one of the most forensically loaded words that could have entered this public record. You do not describe a room as immaculate when you simply mean it was not disturbed. You describe a room as immaculate when its condition is notable. When the cleanliness itself is the thing worth remarking on, and when a source close to a law enforcement investigation chooses that word to describe rooms inside the home of a missing woman, there are two explanations worth sitting inside carefully. The first is the surface one. The rooms were genuinely undisturbed. Nothing violent happened there. The source is conveying that the interior of Nancy Guthrie's home, in those specific spaces, showed no physical evidence of a confrontation. And in that reading, immaculate simply means the interior does not tell the story we feared it might. But there is a second explanation. And in true crime, experienced investigators are trained to consider it seriously. A room can be made to look immaculate. A scene can be controlled. Evidence can be managed. Scene staging is a documented, studied, and frequently encountered phenomenon in real investigations. It happens in cases where the person responsible has the presence of mind, the time, and the access to alter what investigators will eventually find. It happens in cases where the responsible party has enough knowledge of how investigations operate to understand what needs to disappear and what can safely remain. And it happens most often in cases where the crime was not impulsive, where it was thought through, where the person involved had a plan that extended beyond the act itself and into the management of its aftermath. This documentary is not asserting that the scene inside Nancy Guthrie's home was staged. That is not a responsible claim to make based on what has been publicly reported. What it is doing is exactly what Jennifer Coffindaffer did when she read Anton's post. It is naming the possibility. Because responsible true crime analysis does not skip past uncomfortable questions simply because they are uncomfortable. And here's the detail inside Anton's report that most people read past without stopping. His source did not describe the entire house as immaculate. Certain rooms. That qualifier is doing significant work in a way that has not been sufficiently examined publicly. Certain rooms being described as immaculate implies that not every room received that description. It implies a distinction was being drawn between spaces that looked one way and spaces that may have looked entirely another way. What about those other rooms? What did they look like? Anton's post does not tell us. And that absence, that omission of what the rest of the house contained, is exactly the kind of gap that true crime analysis cannot afford to look past. The rooms that were not described as immaculate may be the rooms this investigation actually hinges on. Sheriff Nanis assigned a homicide detective to this case on day one. That fact is confirmed by multiple mainstream outlets. It is not in dispute. A homicide detective was assigned to the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie before a body was found, before a cause of death was established, before the public had any framework for understanding what had happened to her. Homicide detectives are not a precaution. In a county law enforcement agency like PCSD, they handle one specific category of case. Cases where the circumstances are inconsistent with a voluntary exit or a natural end. That is their lane. And the decision to deploy them is not made casually or at a low level of command. It is a classification decision. It is a determination made by someone who has reviewed what first responding deputies reported, assessed the initial evidence, and concluded that what they are looking at is not a standard missing persons case. It is a determination that says, based on what we know right now, we believe this person is not going to be found alive. Now hold that decision against the picture that has been painted publicly of the scene inside that home. Hold it against certain rooms described as immaculate. Hold it against blood confirmed at the front threshold moving outward. Hold it against the forensic profile of a targeted, precise, controlled event. And ask yourself whether those pieces produce a coherent picture. Ask yourself whether what has been publicly described about that scene is sufficient on its own to justify the classification Sheriff Nanos made in the opening hours of this investigation. The honest answer is that it is not. Not without a third piece of information that has not been made public. Blood at a threshold and immaculate rooms describe a serious case. They describe something alarming and demanding of significant law enforcement resources, but on their face they describe a potential abduction from a secured location. And a potential abduction does not automatically generate a homicide classification before the sun comes up. Unless there is something else. Unless what those first deputies found when they walked through that front door included something beyond what has entered the public record. Something that was documented, reviewed by command, and used as the basis for a classification decision that has never been publicly explained. That gap has exactly 3 possible explanations. The first is that the immaculate description is accurate but incomplete. Certain rooms looked undisturbed, while other areas of that home told a different forensic story that has not been publicly released. The second is that the homicide classification was driven not by physical evidence at the scene, but by prior intelligence. Information law enforcement had before they arrived that told them what kind of case they were walking into. The third is that what justified the homicide assignment was something physical, something documented, something the first deputies saw with their own eyes that has never appeared in any press conference or public statement, something that answered the question of what happened to Nancy Guthrie before that question was ever asked publicly. We do not know which explanation is true. What we know is that all 3 exist, and all 3 require the public record of this investigation to be something less than complete. Here's what the evidence builds when you stop looking at it in pieces and let it speak as a whole. A crime that was precise, controlled, contained to a single point of exit in a home where certain rooms were described as immaculate. A blood trail at the front threshold moving outward in a pattern consistent with a person who was upright and mobile when they crossed it. A forensic profile pointing not toward a chaos or impulse, but toward planning, targeting, and a level of insider knowledge about Nancy Guthrie's life that narrows the field of who could be responsible significantly. A trust or coercion dynamic at the door that, combined with a clean interior, suggests whoever was on the other side of that entrance had credibility with the woman inside. A command-level operational decision made by the head of the Pima County Sheriff's Department in the opening hours of this case that classified it as a homicide investigation before the public knew anything, before a body was found, before a cause of death existed on any official document. And a source description of certain rooms inside that home as immaculate that, placed next to that homicide assignment, produces a gap in the public narrative of this investigation that no official has explained, no press conference has addressed, and no public statement has come close to closing. The only version of events that accommodates all of those facts simultaneously, without discarding any of them, is one where law enforcement understood from the very beginning what had happened to Nancy Guthrie, not suspected, not feared, understood. With enough certainty to make a classification decision, in the opening hours of a case they have spent weeks managing publicly, with careful, measured language that has never once explained what they found when they walked through that front door. Something in this case has not been made public, and that is not a theory. It is the conclusion that the public evidence demands. Every confirmed fact, every source detail, every documented decision in this investigation points toward it. The gap between immaculate rooms and a homicide detective on day 1 cannot be closed without it. It exists inside the reports filed by the first deputies who responded, inside the command-level communications that preceded the classification decision, inside whatever Sheriff Nanos reviewed, in those first hours that told him, with enough certainty to act on, that this case belonged to his homicide unit. Jennifer Coffindaffer asked the question publicly. She asked it precisely. She asked it because she knew exactly what the answer would mean for the direction and the integrity of this investigation, and Sheriff Nanos has not answered it. Not in any press conference, not in any public statement, not anywhere in the weeks since Nancy Guthrie's disappearance became a story that the entire country has been following. That silence is the final piece of this picture. And in true crime, it is almost always the silence that tells you where the truth is buried. There are more threads in this case that remain open. The second reported note, the neighboring property, the question of access, and who had it. The timeline in the hours before the disappearance was reported. Each of those threads connects to the larger picture this documentary has been building. Each of them belongs inside the question of what actually happened to Nancy Guthrie, and whether the public narrative of this investigation reflects what law enforcement already knows. We're going to keep pulling every one of those threads. We're going to keep sourcing carefully, attributing precisely, and holding the line between what is confirmed and what is reported every single time. Because this audience deserves that discipline. Because Nancy Guthrie's family deserves it. And because the truth of what happened on the night a woman's blood was found at her own front threshold, while certain rooms behind that door were described as immaculate, deserves every serious, grounded, carefully constructed question this true crime community can bring to bear on it. The inside of that house holds answers the outside world has not been given yet. And until those answers come, the most important thing any of us can do is refuse to stop asking. What was in that house? What did those first deputies see? And why, from day one, did the people who saw it already know how this story was going to end? We will see you in the next one.